Most people believe that power is about reacting, asserting oneself, responding in kind. But that's the biggest illusion you've ever been sold. Because in practice, whoever reacts is being controlled, not the other way around. It's uncomfortable to accept that, I know. But if someone manages to irritate you, provoke you, destabilize you, that person, at that moment, has more control over you than you imagine. And it is precisely here that Machiavelli's most disturbing lessons come in. Not the cliché phrases, but the raw essence. Power is not about dominating others. It's about not being dominated by anyone. Now think about it. How many times have you wasted energy trying to prove something? How many times have you reacted impulsively and then realized you fell into the exact game someone wanted you to play? The truth is, there's a level of control that almost no one teaches you. A level where provocations don't affect you, opinions don't shake you, and emotional games simply cease to work. And no, this has nothing to do with being cold or indifferent. It has to do with understanding real human nature and acting above it. And from here, you'll realize something you may never have considered. Maybe you were never weak. You were just playing the wrong game. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He thought he was in control every time he raised his voice, banged on the table, or reacted impulsively. Deep down, he seemed strong, but anyone observing coldly perceives something else: predictability. And predictability in any power game is a sentence of defeat. Anger is like handing the script for your next action to someone else. Anyone who understands strategy, and here Machiavelli's thinking based on real human nature comes into play, knows that the biggest mistake is reacting exactly as others expect. Politics, guided by reality, not ideals, teaches this with brutal clarity. Whoever loses emotional control relinquishes control of the situation. And ironically, the more someone believes that the end justifies the means through emotional outbursts, the further they move away from the desired outcome. They don't realize it, but by reacting, they expose themselves. By exposing themselves, they weaken. And by weakening, they become vulnerable to being led. Consider a common situation. Someone provokes you at work, makes a scathing comment, tries to belittle you in front of others. What do most people do? They retaliate immediately, trying to win the argument, but at that point they've already lost because they've entered exactly the game the other person wanted. Now imagine the opposite. They listen, observe, and don't react. Silence. A slight glance, perhaps even a half smile, that completely disarms the aggressor, because whoever provokes expects a reaction. When it doesn't come, the game breaks down. That's virtù, the ability to act with strategic intelligence in the face of chaos. It's not passivity, it's mastery. It's the calculated use of force, where the force is not in the attack, but in the control. And this requires something few possess: constant adaptability, knowing when to act, and especially when not to act. The big turning point happens when he realizes that being strong isn't about winning arguments, but about controlling himself within them. Is it better to be feared than loved? Yes, but never at the cost of appearing unstable, because the unstable are not feared, they are avoided or manipulated. And avoiding being hated also involves this. Those who explode easily lose respect. They don't gain power. The true appearance of virtue lies in calmness, posture, and reading the environment. It's almost like an emotional chess game, where each move is thought out and not reacted to. And the more he begins to observe this, the more he realizes that the problem was never the other person. The problem was always how he interpreted the other person. And that's exactly where something begins to change, because understanding this opens a much deeper door, the door to understanding what truly motivates people. He begins to realize something uncomfortable, but liberating. Not everything is about him. In fact, almost nothing is. Most provocations, subtle disrespect, and snide remarks stem much more from the insecurity of the speaker than from any real failing of the listener. This is a central point when observing the world through Machiavelli's lens. Decisions based on real human nature, not on illusions of justice or idealized morality. Those who attack are often afraid of losing ground, afraid of appearing inferior, afraid of not being enough. And when someone understands this, something changes profoundly. They stop reacting as a victim and begin to see as a strategist. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, teaches exactly this. Not to interpret actions by what they should be, but by what they truly are. He begins to notice patterns. The colleague who criticizes too much is usually the most insecure. The person who tries to belittle you in public usually needs constant validation. The friend who makes jokes putting you down almost always carries an internal discomfort they can't admit. And here comes a powerful shift. Instead of reacting emotionally, he begins to analyze, like an experienced player reading the board. This is virtue in action, the ability to understand human behavior without being contaminated by it. It's not about being cold or distant, but about being lucid. And this lucidity prevents him from falling into obvious emotional traps. Because deep down, whoever understands the other no longer feels threatened by them. And whoever doesn't feel threatened doesn't react, they choose. Consider a practical situation. Someone ignores you, treats you with indifference, seems to disrespect you. The common impulse is to take it personally, feel rejected, try to correct it. But now he sees things differently. He thinks, what does this person gain by acting this way? Perhaps control, perhaps attention, perhaps masking their own insecurity. And understanding this, he doesn't play the game. This is constant adaptability, adjusting your interpretation to the context without falling into automatic patterns. Does the end justify the means? Yes, but not in an impulsive sense, but rather strategically. He begins to act surgically, not emotionally. And curiously, the more he understands others, the more he realizes that there is an even more powerful layer, not just understanding human behavior, but deciding how to position himself in relation to it. And this leads to an even more disconcerting point. He now understands the game, but something more refined is still missing: how he positions himself within it. Because understanding human nature is only half the equation. The other half is deciding what to show and what to hide. And this is where one of the most disconcerting tools of power emerges: strategic indifference. Not that empty, cold, and purposeless indifference, but a carefully constructed appearance of virtue. Machiavelli already made it clear, what you feel shouldn't always be what you show. In many cases, showing less means dominating more, because whoever reveals everything they feel loses an advantage. Whoever reacts gives themselves away. Whoever exposes themselves becomes legible. And whoever is legible is manipulable. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands exactly that: control of expression, not just action. He begins to test this in simple situations. Someone tries to provoke him. He doesn't react. Someone ignores him. He doesn't chase after them. Someone speaks ill of him. He doesn't defend himself immediately. And to his surprise, something curious happens. The other person begins to get restless. Because the absence of reaction creates a psychological void, and human beings hate emptiness. When there is no response, the other person's mind begins to fill with doubts, insecurities, interpretations. This is the calculated use of force in its most subtle form. It's not confrontation, it's the strategic absence of confrontation. And ironically, this generates more impact than any aggressive response. Better to be feared than loved. Sometimes being indecipherable is even more powerful than being feared, because fear generates reaction, but doubt paralyzes. Imagine a practical situation. Someone sends you a provocative message expecting conflict. The norm would be to respond immediately, justify yourself, attack back, but they do it differently. They wait, hours, sometimes days, and when they respond with neutrality, almost disinterest. This completely breaks the other person's emotional pattern. And here, virtue comes in again, the ability to act outside the expected, not out of ego, but out of strategy. Avoiding being hated also involves this: not fueling unnecessary conflicts, not giving a platform to those who seek attention through chaos. And the more they practice this posture, the more they realize something disconcerting. Silence begins to speak louder than any argument. And it is at this point that they begin to understand that it's not just about not reacting, but about mastering the right moment to act. Now he begins to see something even deeper. It's not just about not reacting, it's about when to speak. Because in any confrontation, there's an almost invisible detail that defines who's in control. Who speaks first after the provocation? And most of the time, whoever speaks first reveals weakness. Not because speaking is wrong, but because speaking impulsively is to reveal one's emotional state. Machiavelli understood this with surgical precision. Decisions based on real human nature require a reading of time, not just action. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that silence is not absence, it's positioning. It's as if he were saying, without words, I don't need to respond now. And this choice, simple in appearance, completely changes the power dynamic. He begins to apply this in real situations. A discussion starts to heat up. He slows down. Someone tries to pressure him for an immediate answer. He pauses. Instead of filling the space with justifications, he maintains silence. And it's curious. The other person starts to talk more, to expose themselves more, to make mistakes, because silence acts as an uncomfortable mirror. It reflects back to the other person their own behavior. This is calculated use of force, without raising one's voice, without engaging in direct conflict, but guiding the situation. Think of negotiations, for example. Whoever talks too much concedes too much. Whoever rushes loses leverage. But whoever observes, listens, and responds at the right moment shapes the game. This is virtue in practice, not reacting to the other person's timing, but imposing one's own timing. There's a simple exercise he started practicing. When someone pressures him, he responds with a pause. He mentally counts a few seconds before speaking. In difficult conversations, he avoids interrupting. He lets the other person finish, even if they're wrong. This creates an invisible but powerful advantage, because while the other person is emotional, he's strategic. And this, in the long run, builds something few achieve: silent authority. Is it better to be feared than loved? Sometimes it's better to be respected for your calmness than noticed for your reaction. And avoiding being hated also involves not turning everything into a confrontation. Over time, he realizes that silence isn't just a tool, it's a territory. And whoever dominates this territory begins to perceive something even more unsettling. Perhaps the greatest weakness isn't in others, but in the need he still carries to be recognized by them. Here he stumbles upon something more uncomfortable than any external provocation, the very need to be accepted. Because deep down, many of his reactions were never about the other person. They were about not wanting to appear weak, not wanting to be rejected, not wanting to lose validation. And this, within any power game, is a glaring vulnerability. Machiavelli already pointed this out, even if implicitly. Whoever needs to be loved at all costs becomes a hostage. Is it better to be feared than loved? Perhaps, but the deeper point is another, not depending on either. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that constantly seeking approval is giving up one's own autonomy. Because whoever needs to please inevitably adapts too much, and whoever adapts too much gets lost. He begins to notice this in his daily life. How many times has he said yes when he wanted to say no? How many times has he over-explained a simple decision just to avoid seeming rude? How many times has he been bothered by the opinion of someone he doesn't even truly respect? This pattern isn't weakness, it's conditioning, but it remains an exploitable point. And those who understand this begin to gradually cut this invisible dependence. This is virtue, not in the sense of moral perfection, but of inner mastery. Does the end justify the means? Yes. And the means here is to stop negotiating with oneself to maintain the approval of others. He begins to test small movements, not justifying everything, not responding immediately, not seeking validation in every decision. And curiously, the less he tries to please, the more respected he becomes. Consider something simple. Someone disagrees with him. Before, he would try to convince, explain, gain approval. Now, he simply listens and follows. No confrontation, no submission. This generates a strange effect on the other person because it breaks the pattern. The other person expects resistance or agreement and receives independence. This is the calculated use of force on a more internal level. It's not about directly dominating the other, but about not being dominated by the need for acceptance. Avoiding being hated remains important, of course, but not at the cost of giving up oneself. And as he detaches himself from this need, he begins to perceive something even deeper. Perhaps the true battlefield was never external. Perhaps everything always began within. And this leads to an even more decisive territory. Now he realizes something that completely changes the game. It's no use trying to control the world if he can't control himself. Because in the end, all previous strategies, silence, indifference, reading people, crumble if the inner world is in chaos. This is where many fail. They want to appear strong on the outside, but are unstable on the inside. And Machiavelli, even without using these words, pointed to this with brutal clarity. Decisions based on real human nature begin with the mastery of one's own nature. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands this self-control before external control. Because whoever doesn't govern their emotions will be governed by them. And whoever is governed by them will inevitably be manipulated by others. He begins to observe his own patterns more honestly. What throws him off balance? What triggers his anger? What makes him seek approval? Instead of fighting these reactions, he begins to understand them. This is virtue in its deepest form. It's not about eliminating emotions, but about not being controlled by them. He realizes that anger, fear, insecurity are not enemies, they are signals. Signals of something that has not yet been resolved internally. And instead of reacting automatically, he begins to pause, observe, and choose. A simple exercise he begins to apply. Whenever he feels an intense emotion, he doesn't act immediately. He breathes, steps away, buys time. It may seem small, but it changes everything. Because between stimulus and response, power is born. In everyday life, this translates into cleaner decisions. Criticism doesn't destabilize him as much. Provocation doesn't drag him into conflict. Rejection doesn't make him doubt himself. This doesn't mean he doesn't feel. It means he doesn't get lost in what he feels. This is calculated use of force, directed inward before being applied outward. Better to be feared than loved, perhaps. But before that, he needs to be respected by himself. And avoiding being hated also begins internally, avoiding self-sabotage, avoiding acting against his own principles impulsively. Little by little, he builds something rare, emotional stability. And this stability creates a foundation that few can shake. And when this foundation begins to solidify, he realizes that it's not just about reacting better, but about playing a completely different game. Now he begins to see something that most ignore: time. Because in the end, it's not the immediate movement that defines the game, it's the sequence of movements over time. And those who live reacting in the short term never build real power. Machiavelli understood this clearly. Virtue is not just acting well, it's acting with vision. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands strategic patience. Not that passive patience of someone who waits without direction, but an active, calculated patience where each decision is part of a larger plan. The problem is that impulse always seems stronger in the moment. The desire to respond, to correct, to solve it now. But those who act like this trade future advantage for immediate relief. And this silently weakens any position. He begins to observe how people sabotage themselves precisely because they can't stand waiting. They want quick recognition. They want immediate validation. They want to prove something all the time. And this makes them predictable. And predictability, as he has already learned, is weakness. Does the end justify the means? Yes, but only when the end is truly strategic. And strategy requires time. Think of something practical. Instead of trying to win an argument today, he chooses to build a consistent image over the months. Instead of reacting to every provocation, he selects when it's worthwhile to act. This is constant adaptability, adjusting behavior to the scenario without losing direction. And interestingly, the more he thinks about the long term, the less he feels the need to react in the short term. A simple example: someone tries to harm or belittle him. Before, he would engage in direct confrontation. Now he observes, registers, understands the pattern, and acts at the right moment if necessary. Sometimes the best response isn't immediate, it's strategic. It might be improving his results, positioning himself better, or even silently withdrawing. This is the calculated use of force in its most refined form. Better to be feared than loved, perhaps. But even more important is being respected for consistency, because lasting respect doesn't arise from impulsive reactions. It arises from stable behavior over time. And avoiding being hated also involves this, not turning every conflict into a war. As he internalizes this, he begins to perceive something even more powerful. When you play the long game, many battles cease to make sense. And this opens space for something even more radical. Now he reaches a point that few achieve, and even fewer sustain. He becomes difficult to reach. Not because the world has changed, but because he has changed the way he interacts with the world. The provocations continue to exist. People continue to try to test limits. The game continues. But now, he no longer finds anything to hold on to, because before there were triggers. There was a need for a response, a need for validation, a need to prove something. Now there isn't, and this creates something extremely powerful, an absence of emotional levers. Machiavelli, when talking about control and power, always revolved around this. Whoever cannot be manipulated cannot be controlled. And decisions based on real human nature show exactly that. True power lies not in dominating others, but in not being dominated by them. He doesn't become cold, distant, or apathetic. On the contrary, he becomes more aware. The difference is that now there is choice. He chooses when to care. He chooses when to react. He chooses when to get involved. This is virtue at its highest level, emotional autonomy. Does the end justify the means? Yes. And the means here is to build such a solid internal structure that nothing external can easily destabilize it. He begins to realize that he doesn't need to win arguments. He doesn't need to correct all misperceptions. He doesn't need to answer everything. This is not weakness. It's energy conservation. It's the calculated use of force applied to one's own attention. Because attention is also power, and he stops wasting that power on small things. Better to be feared than loved? Perhaps. But even more powerful is to be ignored by those who don't matter and respected by those who truly observe. In practice, this manifests itself silently. Someone tries to provoke you. They can't. Someone tries to manipulate you. They find no space. Someone tries to diminish you. It has no effect. And this, over time, completely changes the perception of those around you. Because human beings respect what they cannot shake. Avoiding being hated remains part of the game, of course, but without abandoning one's own internal structure. And the longer one remains in this state, the more one realizes that the game ceased to be external a long time ago. Now, the true field is internal, silent, invisible, and whoever dominates this field doesn't need to prove anything. But this raises an inevitable question. If you truly can no longer be affected, who do you become from here on out? Now let me ask you something. Without filtering, how many times have you surrendered your power without realizing it? How many times have you reacted impulsively, sought approval, tried to explain yourself, and come out smaller than you went in? Because the truth is harsh, but liberating. No one ever had power over you. You surrendered it, little by little, in each automatic reaction, in each need to be accepted, in each moment you lost control of yourself. And as long as you continue reacting, you will continue to be predictable. And predictability, as you've seen, is weakness disguised as attitude. But now you know. You know that silence is power. You know that strategic indifference disarms. You know that understanding human nature puts you above the game. You know that detachment from approval sets you free. And above all, you know that mastering your inner world completely changes the outer world. So the question that remains is not what to do. It's what will you stop doing from now on? Will you continue reacting? Will you continue trying to convince those who don't want to understand? Will you continue giving energy to those who don't even deserve your attention? Or will you actually start playing on another level? If this made sense to you, don't let it die here. Apply it, test it, observe it, adjust it, because knowledge that doesn't become action becomes an illusion. And if you want to continue evolving in this type of mindset, more strategic, more conscious, more difficult to manipulate, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here you don't learn to react better, you learn not to be controlled.